Imagine a world where the simplest cut could lead to a swift, agonizing end. Imagine a time when the most natural human event was shrouded in a terrifying mystery, a dance with death performed by every woman. What if the act of bringing new life into the world was, for mothers, the single most terrifying experience they could ever face in 1235? Number 1. The peril of multiples, a double-edged blessing. Picture this: you are a woman in 1235, already enduring the immense physical and emotional toll of pregnancy, your body changing in ways both miraculous and frightening. You have felt the stirring of one life within you, perhaps even pictured the tiny face, the small hands. But what if, as your body grew larger, far larger than any of your neighbors or the midwife had ever seen, a chilling thought began to take root in your mind? What if there was more than one baby? Prospect of carrying and then delivering multiple infants was not merely a logistical challenge in the 13th century. It was a profound amplification of every existing fear, a multiplier of the dangers that already lurked in the shadows of childbirth. For a woman in 1235, the idea of having twins, let alone triplets or more, was a notion steeped in a complex mix of wonder and absolute terror. While the birth of healthy children was always seen as a blessing, a gift from God, the mechanics of such a delivery were a nightmare. The human body is designed to deliver one baby at a time, and even that singular event was often a battle for survival. Now imagine it attempting to expel 2, 3, or even more tiny bodies, each demanding passage through the same narrow canal. Historical records, sparse as they are from this period concerning individual childbirth experiences, hint at the profound difficulties faced by women who were carrying multiples. Accounts from medieval chronicles and medical texts, rudimentary though they were, sometimes describe protracted labors where the first twin might be born, only for the mother to remain in agonizing, seemingly unending labor as the second, or even third, child refused to follow with ease. The challenges began long before labor even started. A woman carrying multiples would experience an even greater strain on her already limited nutritional resources. Food was often scarce, and balanced diets were a luxury few could afford, especially among the peasant class that made up the vast majority of the population. Carrying 2 or more growing lives meant a magnified drain on the mother's strength, leading to extreme fatigue, anemia, and a general weakening of her constitution. This diminished strength would, in turn, make the ordeal of labor itself even more perilous. A woman already teetering on the edge of exhaustion, her body malnourished, was far less likely to withstand the hours, sometimes days, of intense exertion required for a single birth, let alone the compounded efforts for multiples. Then came the labor. Positioning of multiple babies within the womb could be incredibly complicated. Instead of one baby presenting head first, perfectly aligned for passage, there might be a tangle of limbs, a baby-positioned breech, or a transverse lie where a baby was sideways. Without the ability to perform accurate internal examinations, and certainly without the knowledge or tools for effective intervention, the midwife was left to rely on instinct, prayer, and basic manual adjustments. Imagine the sheer terror of a midwife trying to discern which limb belonged to which infant, or trying to gently encourage a malpositioned baby to turn, all while the mother screamed in agony, her body pushed to its absolute limits. Cases of twins presenting simultaneously, or one blocking the path of another, would have been catastrophic. Compression of the umbilical cords during delivery, the risk of asphyxia for one or both babies, and the increased likelihood of tearing and severe trauma to the mother's birth canal were all magnified. The post-delivery dangers were also greatly increased. The uterus, having stretched to accommodate multiple lives, was far more likely to struggle with contracting back down effectively after the births. This meant an exponentially higher risk of postpartum hemorrhage, where the mother could bleed out rapidly, her life force draining away in a matter of minutes or hours. Placenta needed to be delivered, and the failure of one or more to detach cleanly could lead to further complications, infection, and continued bleeding. The mere presence of multiple placentas meant multiple sites for potential complication. The midwife's task was not over once the babies were born. She then had to manage the expulsion of these vital organs, a process fraught with its own danger. The infant mortality rate for single births was already tragically high in 1235, with many babies succumbing within their first days, weeks, or months of life. For multiples, this rate skyrocketed. Babies born prematurely, as twins often were due to the constrained space in the womb, faced overwhelming odds. Their lungs might not be fully developed, their bodies too fragile to cope with the shock of birth and the harsh realities of medieval life. Without incubators, without specialized care for premature infants, a tiny, underdeveloped baby had little chance of survival. Even if they survived the initial birth, the struggle to nurse two infants at once, for a mother whose own strength was depleted, presented immense difficulties. Wet nurses, if available, were an added expense that most families could not afford. The demand on the mother's milk supply would be immense, and if she was weak or undernourished, her ability to sustain two or more infants through breastfeeding might be severely compromised, leading to malnutrition for the babies. Beyond the physical dangers, there was a profound psychological toll. A woman in 1235 would have known, intellectually and emotionally, that the risks were amplified. Her community would have known too. Whispers and concerned glances would follow her as her belly swelled to an unusual size. Prayers offered for her during labor would be even more fervent, tinged with a deeper sense of dread. The anxiety of facing one life or death struggle was immense. Facing two or more simultaneously would have been an almost unbearable burden. The sight of two tiny, fragile beings, each a miniature version of the overwhelming task she had just endured, would have been a stark reminder of the immense peril she had navigated. Potential for loss, not just of one child, but of two or three, compounded the emotional devastation. The baby carried its own set of hopes, dreams, and immense vulnerability. To lose one was heartbreaking. To lose multiples would have been a soul-crushing tragedy for the mother and her family. The very idea of having twins then, while perhaps carrying a faint shimmer of novelty or even divine favor in some rare instances, was primarily a source of intensified fear, a sign that the already treacherous path of childbirth was about to become infinitely more treacherous. Number 2, malnutrition and weakness, a body already fragile. Imagine entering the most physically demanding, life or death ordeal of your existence when your body is already running on empty. 1235, for the vast majority of women, especially those in rural communities or urban working classes, pregnancy and childbirth were not undertaken from a position of strength and optimal health. Instead, they were often faced by bodies already weakened by a lifetime of insufficient nutrition, arduous labor, and recurrent illness. This pervasive state of malnutrition and general physical debility was not just a background factor. It was a fundamental, terrifying vulnerability that dramatically increased the risks of childbirth. Daily life for a medieval woman was physically demanding. From dawn until dusk, she might be engaged in tasks like tending gardens, raising livestock, processing food, fetching water from distant wells, grinding grain, spinning wool, and caring for her household and existing children. This constant expenditure of energy, coupled with a diet that was often deficient in essential nutrients, meant that few women began their pregnancies with a robust physiological reserve. Their diets were frequently monotonous, consisting mainly of grains like bread and porridge, with limited access to protein from meat or fish, fresh fruits or vegetables, especially during the harsh winter months. Dairy products, while more accessible, could not compensate for all deficiencies. The concept of a balanced diet, as we understand it today, was entirely unknown. A pregnant woman in 1235 would not have received any special dietary considerations or supplements. The idea that she needed more iron to prevent anemia, or more calcium for her developing baby's bones, or more protein for her own bodily repairs and the growth of the fetus, was completely outside the realm of medical understanding. If anything, folk beliefs might have dictated certain food restrictions during pregnancy, further limiting her intake. As a result, many women would have entered their final trimester, the period of most rapid fetal growth and greatest demand on the mother's body, already suffering from chronic fatigue, muscle weakness, and debilitating anemia. Anemia, a common condition caused by iron deficiency, would have left women pale, breathless, and profoundly exhausted, their blood simply lacking the capacity to carry enough oxygen to their tissues or to a laboring uterus. During labor itself, this underlying weakness became critically apparent. Childbirth was an endurance event, often lasting for many hours, sometimes even days. A woman whose muscles were already weak from lack of protein and energy, whose heart was straining due to anemia, and whose overall stamina was depleted, would struggle immensely to sustain the powerful contractions needed to expel the baby. Her uterus, itself a large muscle, might be too weak to contract effectively, leading to prolonged labor, a condition known as uterine inertia. This prolonged labor would further exhaust her, draining her remaining reserves and increasing the risk of complications such as hemorrhage or infection, as the birthing passages remained open for an extended period. The body, already struggling to fuel basic life processes, would simply run out of the necessary strength to complete the most demanding physical task it would ever undertake. Furthermore, a weakened immune system, a direct consequence of long-term malnutrition, meant that a woman was far more susceptible to infections before, during, and after childbirth. Even a seemingly minor scratch or tear could quickly become a raging, life-threatening infection in a body unable to mount an effective defense. The very act of birth, involving open wounds and exposure, became an invitation for unseen microscopic killers to take hold. A woman's recovery after birth would also be severely hampered. Her body, depleted of nutrients, would struggle to heal torn tissues, to replenish lost blood, and to produce milk for her newborn. The period of lying in, the traditional period of rest and recovery after birth, was often cut short by the demands of daily life and household chores, especially for poorer women who could not afford to truly rest. This premature return to strenuous activity further compromised her recovery and exposed her to even greater risks of complications, including the recurrence of bleeding or the development of chronic health issues. Beyond the immediate physical dangers, there was the profound psychological burden of feeling physically incapable. Imagine knowing, deep in your bones, that you are not strong enough for the monumental task ahead. Fear would not only be of the pain or the unseen dangers, but of your own body simply failing you, giving up, unable to complete its sacred duty. This feeling of helplessness, of being a fragile vessel for a powerful biological process, would have added another layer of terror to the childbirth experience. Historical narratives, though not explicit on this specific detail, implicitly convey the vulnerability of women through accounts of frequent maternal deaths and the high infant mortality rates that dominated the medieval period. The sheer number of pregnancies a woman might endure throughout her fertile years, often close together due to the lack of birth control and the desire for surviving heirs, would further compound this cumulative weakening of her body. Each pregnancy, each birth, chipped away at her already limited reserves, making the next one even more perilous. A woman in 1235 was not just delivering a baby, she was attempting a feat of incredible endurance with a body that was often a battlefield of deficiencies, making survival itself a precarious and uncertain hope. Number 3, the lack of hygiene, an invisible threat. Imagine entering a medieval home, a place of warmth, hearth, and family, but also a place where the concept of invisible germs was as alien as flying to the moon. Now imagine this setting as the stage for childbirth, a highly invasive and often messy event. In 1235, the greatest threats were often the ones no one could see or understand, lurking on unwashed hands, dirty surfaces, and in the very air itself. The profound lack of even basic hygiene was not merely an inconvenience. It was a silent, relentless killer, turning the sacred act of birth into a perilous gateway for deadly infections, a source of profound and terrifying fear for every woman. The world of 1235 was not sterile, far from it. Personal cleanliness, as we know it, was a rare luxury, largely confined to the wealthy, and even then, their understanding of sanitation was rudimentary at best. For the average woman, bathing was infrequent and often involved shared water, if available at all. Clothes were worn for extended periods without washing. Hands, the primary tools for daily life, were rarely, if ever, truly cleaned with anything resembling soap and water, especially by today's standards. This general state of unhygiene permeated every aspect of life, but its implications for childbirth were particularly catastrophic. Consider the birthing environment. A woman in labor would typically be in her own home, often in a small, poorly ventilated room. The straw on the floor, the animal dander, the residual smells of cooking and daily life, none of these were seen as problematic in the context of health. There were no sterile sheets, no disinfected surfaces, and certainly no antiseptic solution. The concept of germs causing disease was millennia away from being understood. Instead, illness was attributed to imbalances of humors, bad air, divine displeasure, or malevolent spirits. This fundamental misunderstanding meant that no conscious effort was made to prevent the spread of what we now know to be bacteria and viruses. The hands of the midwife, the birthing attendants, and often the family members who might assist, were perhaps the greatest vectors of unseen danger. A midwife might attend to multiple births in quick succession, or move from tending to a sick family member, or even an animal, directly to assisting a woman in labor, all without washing her hands. Even if she did wash, it would be a simple rinse in unheated, likely unboiled water, utterly ineffective against microscopic pathogens. Imagine her hands, perhaps having just handled raw meat or helped a sick child, now reaching into the mother's body to assist with a difficult delivery, to check the progression of labor, or to help deliver the placenta. Touch was an unwitting introduction of potentially lethal bacteria directly into the open wounds and susceptible tissues of the birthing canal. Fear here was not just of pain, but of a creeping, invisible sickness that could take hold days later, after the immediate danger of labor seemed to have passed. Any instruments used, however few and rudimentary, were also sources of profound contamination. Perhaps a knife was used to cut the umbilical cord or a sharp object to release membranes. These tools would not be sterilized. They would be used, wiped clean of visible mess, and then put away, ready for the next use. There was no boiling, no fire sterilization, no chemical disinfection. The very tools meant to help could become agents of death. Even simpler aids, like sponges or cloths used for wiping, would be reused, creating a cycle of cross-contamination. The birthing process itself created open pathways for infection. The mother's perineum could tear, her cervix could become abraded, and the vast inner surface of the uterus, where the placenta had been attached, was essentially a massive open wound. These areas were highly vulnerable. Bacteria introduced from unwashed hands, unsterile instruments, or even from the woman's own skin or intestinal tract could quickly enter the bloodstream, leading to puerperal fever, a horrifying, rapid-onset infection that often proved fatal. Fever would spike, chills would rack the body, and the mother would descend into delirium, her life draining away over a matter of days. This was not a rare occurrence. Puerperal fever was a leading cause of maternal mortality throughout the medieval period and for centuries thereafter. The chilling truth was that the very act of assistance could unintentionally be the cause of death. For the woman in labor, this lack of hygiene translated into a terrifying uncertainty. She might survive the immediate agony of birth, only to succumb days later to a mysterious, burning sickness. She might feel a sense of relief when her baby was born, only for a fever to seize her, a stark reminder that the danger had only just begun. The invisible enemy was arguably the most frightening because it was the least understood. You could see blood, you could feel pain, but you could not see the tiny organisms that were infiltrating your body and slowly, relentlessly killing you. This silent, unseen killer, fueled by the absence of even the most basic understanding of cleanliness, made childbirth in 1235 a gamble against odds that were stacked profoundly against the mother, a terrifying reality where the very air around you seemed to hold a deadly secret. Number 4, the burden of reputation. What if you failed? Beyond the very real physical dangers of childbirth in 1235, there lay a profound and relentless pressure that weighed heavily on a woman's mind, a fear that was less about blood and pain and more about social standing, family honor, and the very definition of her worth. This was the burden of reputation, the terrifying question of what if you fail. Failure in this context could mean several things: the inability to conceive, the loss of a child during birth, or perhaps most devastatingly, the death of the mother herself without producing a living heir. For a woman in the medieval world, these outcomes were not just personal tragedies. They were public statements about her perceived capabilities, her virtue, and her fundamental purpose in society. In 1235, a woman's primary role and source of social validation were inextricably linked to her ability to bear children, especially sons. Lineage, inheritance, and the continuation of the family name were paramount, particularly among the nobility and landowners, but also deeply important to every stratum of society. A woman who was unable to conceive, or who suffered repeated miscarriages or stillbirths, might be seen as barren, cursed, or even somehow morally lacking. This perception could lead to immense shame, whispers in the community, and even the threat of repudiation or divorce, particularly if her husband sought an heir elsewhere. Imagine the psychological torment of knowing that your very existence and social standing were dependent on a biological process fraught with such danger and uncertainty. Fear of infertility or barrenness was a silent terror that preceded pregnancy, and for those who did conceive, the fear of failing to produce a living child was ever present. Even if a woman became pregnant, the journey was far from over. Death of an infant during or shortly after birth, a tragically common occurrence, was not just a personal heartbreak, but also a blow to the family's prospects and the mother's standing. While compassion might be extended, there was also an underlying societal expectation that a woman should bring forth healthy offspring. Repeated infant deaths, or even a single stillbirth after a long, arduous labor, could cast a shadow over the mother, implying a weakness in her constitution or even a lack of divine favor. For the woman herself, the emotional toll of losing a child was compounded by the societal pressure to produce a living heir. Her worth, in many ways, was measured by the cradle. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the burden of reputation was the fear of dying in childbirth without leaving a living heir, especially a son. This was the ultimate failure in the eyes of many. A woman who perished in labor left behind a family without a mother, and crucially, without the promise of future generations. Her sacrifice, though immense, might be overshadowed by the profound loss of her potential to produce more children. Her husband would be left a widower, likely to remarry quickly to secure an heir, and her memory might be tinged with the tragedy of her unfulfilled primary duty. For a noblewoman, the stakes were even higher. Her marriage might have been a strategic alliance, and her failure to provide an heir could jeopardize entire political arrangements or family fortunes. Pressure to deliver a living child, particularly a male one, was immense, bordering on suffocating. This societal pressure was not just an abstract concept. It manifested in the very actions and expectations placed upon a woman. She might be subjected to religious rituals or folk remedies to ensure fertility and a successful birth, creating a sense of personal responsibility for outcomes that were largely beyond her control. The midwife, too, faced immense pressure. Her reputation depended on successful births, and if a mother or baby died under her care, her standing in the community could be severely damaged, making it harder for her to find work. This pressure, in turn, fed back into the mother's fear, as she knew that any complications or unfortunate outcomes would reflect not only on her, but also on the woman helping her. The terror of dying in childbirth was therefore multifaceted. It was the fear of agonizing physical pain and of death itself, yes, but also the fear of leaving her existing children motherless and the fear of being remembered as a failure. Her legacy, her very purpose, was tied to the successful perpetuation of her family line. Fail in this, to die without leaving a living testament to her efforts, was to die with her most fundamental societal duty unfulfilled. This profound weight of expectation, this invisible chain of societal judgment, added an agonizing layer of psychological stress to an already physically dangerous ordeal. It was a fear that transcended the immediate moment of labor, extending into the very meaning of a woman's life and her enduring mark on the world of 1235, a world where the measure of a woman was often found in the strength of her womb and the number of her children. Number 5. Superstition and rituals, desperate whispers to the unknown. Imagine standing on the precipice of a terrifying unknown, your body racked with pain, and the only hope offered is a collection of whispers, charms, and ancient rituals. 1235, when scientific understanding of the human body and disease was practically non-existent, and medical intervention was rudimentary at best, women facing the ordeal of childbirth often turned to a tapestry of superstition, folk remedies, and religious rituals. This reliance on the mystical and the unproven was not merely a quaint cultural practice. It was a desperate, terrifying act born of profound helplessness, and its very nature underscored the overwhelming fear of the unknown dangers of birth. Dominant belief system in medieval Europe was Christianity, and prayers and appeals to saints were central to almost every aspect of life, especially for critical moments like childbirth. Women would pray to the Virgin Mary, and especially to specific saints associated with childbirth, such as Saint Margaret of Antioch, whose legend involved her escaping from the belly of a dragon. Relics of saints, or even pieces of parchment inscribed with prayers or Bible verses, might be placed on the laboring woman's belly or in her hands, believed to offer protection and ease the birth. Crosses might be marked on the bed frame, or holy water sprinkled about the room. The sheer intensity and volume of these religious rituals were a testament to the community's profound anxiety and the mother's own terror. It was an acknowledgement that human agency alone was often insufficient against the forces at play. Beyond formal religious practices, a vast array of folk remedies and superstitions permeated the childbirth experience. These were often rooted in ancient traditions, passed down through generations of women and local healers. Imagine being given a strange concoction of herbs, some perhaps genuinely medicinal, others utterly inert or even harmful, brewed with specific intentions. Perhaps a stone of birth or a piece of coral might be placed near you, believed to possess sympathetic magic to hasten delivery. Certain movements might be prescribed, like opening all the doors and windows in the house, or untying all knots, to symbolize the opening of the birth canal and ease the baby's passage. A belt, perhaps blessed or imbued with magical properties, might be tied around the abdomen. Air would be thick with the scent of burning herbs, meant to ward off evil spirits or draw out illness. The terrifying aspect of these practices was their unpredictability and their inherent powerlessness against actual physiological complications. While some herbal remedies might have had mild sedative or uterine toning properties, they were utterly ineffective against a hemorrhage, an obstructed labor, or a rampant infection. A woman might endure hours of excruciating pain, clutching a saint's relic, swallowing a bitter brew, and listening to the murmurs of incantations, only to realize that the rituals were failing and the baby was no closer to coming, or her strength was ebbing away. This realization that the last lines of defense were proving futile would have been a profoundly terrifying moment of despair. Moreover, some folk practices could inadvertently cause harm. Unhygienic applications of substances or the use of sharp objects for symbolic purposes could introduce infection. The desperate nature of some remedies might involve physically manipulating the mother in ways that were more damaging than helpful. The very act of performing these rituals, often with an air of grave solemnity, served as a constant reminder to the woman that she was in a perilous, life or death situation, dependent on forces beyond her comprehension or control. Whispered prayer, each strange item placed upon her, reinforced the idea that she was battling not just a physiological process, but possibly malevolent spirits, curses, or divine displeasure. Fear wasn't just that these rituals might fail, it was also the fear that their failure implied something darker. Prayers didn't work if the charms offered no protection. Was it because of a sin she had committed? Was she being punished? This added an immense layer of psychological burden, guilt, and spiritual dread to an already terrifying physical ordeal. The burden of ensuring a successful birth therefore shifted not just to the physical body, but also to the spiritual purity and good fortune of the woman herself. In a world devoid of effective medical science, superstition and rituals offered a desperate, if often false, sense of control. They were the only available tools to address the immense anxieties surrounding childbirth. For the woman in labor, surrounded by these desperate whispers to the unknown, knowing that the outcome was still overwhelmingly uncertain, the reliance on such practices was a stark, terrifying reminder of her utter vulnerability and the immense, unquantifiable nature of the threat she faced. Chanted verse and each strange object became a symbol not of comfort, but of the deep, pervasive fear that permeated the very act of bringing new life into the world in 1235. Number 6, the primitive tools, no help in sight. Imagine the most critical moment of your life, a moment where your very survival hangs in the balance, and the people around you, though well-meaning, possess only the most rudimentary understanding of your body and a terrifying scarcity of effective instruments to help you. In 1235, the absence of specialized medical tools, or even basic, hygienic ones, was a profound source of fear for women in labor. It meant that when complications arose, when the natural process of birth veered into dangerous territory, there was often no real help in sight, only desperation, prayer, and the stark reality of primitive limitations. The medical landscape of the 13th century was vastly different from our own. Surgery, when performed at all, was a dangerous, often fatal endeavor, typically carried out by barbers or itinerants rather than trained physicians. The concept of a gynecologist or obstetrician, a doctor specializing in women's health and childbirth, did not exist. Childbirth was almost exclusively the domain of women, specifically midwives, who learned their trade through apprenticeship and generations of passed-down wisdom, often without formal training in anatomy or physiology. Their knowledge, while practical in many ways, was largely observational and lacked a scientific basis. When labor progressed normally, a skilled midwife could certainly offer comfort, encouragement, and guidance. She understood the rhythms of birth and could often tell when a baby was coming. But what happened when things went wrong? What if the baby was malpositioned, presenting breech or sideways? What if the labor was prolonged, the mother exhausting, or the baby stuck? These were the moments when the lack of tools became a death sentence. There were no forceps to gently guide a struggling baby, no vacuum extractors to assist. There were no scalpels for a cesarean section, a procedure that, even if attempted, was almost invariably fatal for the mother due to infection and hemorrhage. The only tools available were often the midwife's hands, and perhaps a simple knife for cutting the umbilical cord, a knife that was almost certainly not sterilized. Imagine the horror of a prolonged, obstructed labor. The midwife might try to manually manipulate the baby, a process that was incredibly painful for the mother and potentially damaging for both. The baby was simply too large, or positioned in such a way that natural delivery was impossible. The options were stark and brutal. In desperate cases, often when the baby was already known to be dead, the midwife might resort to embryotomy, a horrific procedure involving the dismemberment of the fetus within the womb to save the mother's life. This was an act of last resort, a testament to the absolute lack of gentler alternatives and an unimaginable trauma for the mother, who would be fully conscious throughout. The very thought of such a possibility would have cast a dark shadow over every woman's pregnancy. Beyond direct intervention, the absence of diagnostic tools was also a terrifying limitation. There was no way to accurately assess the size of the baby in relation to the mother's pelvis, no way to monitor the fetal heartbeat to detect distress, and no way to definitively tell if the baby was alive or dead within the womb until much later in labor, or even after. The midwife relied on external palpation and her experience, but her ability to truly understand the internal mechanics of the birth was severely limited. This meant that potentially fatal complications could go undetected until it was far too late to do anything about them, leaving mother and baby at the mercy of fate. The fear, then, was not just of pain or death, but of helplessness. It was the terrifying knowledge that if your body or your baby deviated from the normal path of birth, there was no expert with sophisticated instruments to step in and solve the problem. There was no safety net. You were entirely dependent on the natural process, and if that process faltered, the options were incredibly limited, agonizing, and often ultimately fatal. The midwife, for all her experience and compassion, was often a witness to tragedy as much as she was an assistant to birth. The lack of specialized knowledge extended to aftercare as well. There were no sutures to repair severe tears, no blood transfusions to combat hemorrhage, no antibiotics to fight infection. The tools of recovery were as primitive as the tools of delivery. This meant that even if a woman survived a difficult birth, she might be left with severe, lifelong injuries, such as fistulas, which are holes between the vagina and the bladder or rectum, leading to constant incontinence and social ostracization. These hidden injuries, often resulting from prolonged pressure during obstructed labor, were a terrifying consequence of the lack of effective intervention tools and knowledge, and they underscore the profound fear that childbirth could leave a woman not just dead, but permanently damaged and profoundly diminished. In 1235, when things went wrong, the terrifying truth was that there was simply no true help in sight. Number 7, the lost life, infant mortality's cruel grip. Imagine enduring the excruciating agony of childbirth, battling for hours or even days, only to have your newborn take but a few gasping breaths before slipping away. Perhaps the baby survives the initial ordeal, only to succumb within days or weeks to a mysterious fever, a sudden chill, or a debilitating cough. In 1235, for every woman, the specter of infant mortality was a constant, haunting shadow that loomed over every pregnancy and cast a pall over the joy of every birth. Fear was not just of the mother's own death, but of the ultimate, crushing disappointment and heartbreak of bringing a life into the world only for it to be snatched away almost immediately, a terrifying reality that made motherhood a constant act of hope against overwhelming odds. The statistics, though not formally collected in the medieval period, suggest an infant mortality rate that is almost incomprehensible by modern standards. Estimates vary, but it is generally accepted that anywhere from 20 to 50% of all children born alive would not survive their first year of life. Many, perhaps most, of these deaths occurred in the first few days or weeks after birth. This was not a rare tragedy. It was an everyday occurrence, woven into the very structure of life and death in 1235. Every family had experienced it. Every woman knew the pain of it, whether personally or through the stories of her neighbors and relatives. Causes of such widespread infant death were numerous and interconnected, and almost entirely beyond the understanding or control of medieval people. Firstly, many babies simply did not survive the birth process itself. Difficult or prolonged labors could lead to fetal distress, oxygen deprivation, or physical injury to the baby. Without the ability to intervene effectively or monitor the baby's health during labor, a seemingly normal birth could end in a stillbirth or a live birth where the infant was too weak to thrive. Babies born prematurely, as was often the case for malnourished mothers or those carrying multiples, had virtually no chance of survival without specialized care. Tiny bodies were simply too fragile, their lungs too undeveloped, to cope with the harsh environment outside the womb. Once born, newborns faced an onslaught of invisible dangers. Infection was a primary killer. The unsanitary conditions of medieval homes, the unwashed hands of attendants, and the lack of understanding about germ transmission meant that newborns were highly susceptible to infections of the umbilical cord, the eyes, or the respiratory tract. A simple common cold for an adult could quickly become a deadly pneumonia for a fragile infant. Diarrheal diseases, often caused by contaminated water or food, were rampant and rapidly fatal for infants, leading to severe dehydration. Without knowledge of rehydration techniques, a baby could simply waste away within a day or two. Beyond acute illnesses, malnutrition also played a significant role. The mother was too weak or ill to breastfeed effectively, or if her milk supply was insufficient due to her own poor nutrition, the infant would suffer. Alternative feeding methods, such as animal milk, were often unhygienic and difficult for an infant's digestive system to process, leading to further illness. Wet nurses, if available and affordable, offered some relief, but their own health and the cleanliness of their practices were also factors. The sheer vulnerability of a newborn, completely dependent on its mother for survival, was heightened by the precariousness of the mother's own health and the harsh realities of their environment. The terrifying aspect of infant mortality for a woman in 1235 was the absolute helplessness she felt. She had no means to prevent these deaths. She might pray, use charms, or follow every piece of folk wisdom, but when the fever took hold or the baby simply stopped breathing, there was nothing she could do. The emotional toll was immense. Imagine the immense investment of hope, pain, and expectation during pregnancy, culminating in the joy and relief of birth, only to have that joy swiftly replaced by profound grief and desolation. Fear was not just of the potential loss, but of the almost certainty that some of her children would not survive, a cruel lottery of life and death that she had no control over. This pervasive reality meant that mothers often held a cautious, almost hesitant, attachment to their newborns in the first few weeks or months. While love was undeniably present, the constant threat of loss meant that celebrating too soon or forming too deep a bond was a risk to one's own emotional survival. Some historical accounts suggest that babies might not be formally named until they had survived a certain period, or that parents might have been reluctant to invest too heavily emotionally until the initial precarious months had passed. This wasn't a lack of love, but a psychological defense mechanism against the overwhelming probability of heartbreak. Fear of infant mortality in 1235 was a deep, gnawing anxiety that shadowed every woman's journey into motherhood, a constant reminder that life was precious, fleeting, and utterly vulnerable to the unseen forces of fate and disease. Number 8. The shadow of death, mother's mortality. Imagine knowing with a chilling certainty that the very act of bringing new life into the world could, and often would, mean the end of your own. In 1235, the most visceral and terrifying fear for any woman facing childbirth was the profound and ever-present shadow of death, her own mortality. This was not a theoretical risk. It was a common reality, woven into the fabric of medieval life, a stark statistic that touched every family and community. Maternal mortality rates were astronomically high, making childbirth the leading cause of death for women of reproductive age, a horrifying lottery where every pregnancy was a roll of the dice with her very life. While precise statistics from 1235 are impossible to gather, historical estimates suggest that perhaps 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 women would die in childbirth or due to complications arising from it. Some estimates are even higher for specific regions or time periods. Put that into perspective. Imagine a group of 10 women in your village, all of childbearing age. At least one and possibly more would not survive their reproductive years because of childbirth. This was a fate that every woman knew, intimately, could be hers. She would have seen it in her mother, her sisters, her friends, or her neighbors. The sounds of a difficult labor, the frantic whispers, the eventual silence, and then the mourning, were familiar refrains in medieval communities. Causes of maternal death were varied, but largely unmanageable with the medical knowledge and tools of the time. The most common killers included uncontrolled bleeding after birth, known as postpartum hemorrhage, was a swift and brutal killer. The uterus, having expelled the baby and placenta, needed to contract firmly to close off the vast network of blood vessels that had supplied the placenta. Failed to do so, or if there were retained pieces of placenta, the woman could bleed out in minutes or hours. Without understanding blood transfusions or effective uterotonic drugs, there was no way to stop this internal bleeding, and a woman could simply drain away her life. This was arguably the most terrifying and sudden of the immediate dangers. As explored earlier, puerperal fever was rampant. Any tears or abrasions in the birth canal, the massive wound left by the detached placenta in the uterus, and the lack of hygiene made the mother highly susceptible to bacterial infections. These could spread rapidly, leading to sepsis, a systemic inflammatory response that overwhelms the body and leads to organ failure. A woman might survive the birth only to develop a raging fever days later, descending into delirium and then death, a prolonged and agonizing end. When the baby was too large, or malpositioned, or the mother's pelvis too narrow, labor could go on for days. This prolonged compression of the birth canal could lead to maternal exhaustion, uterine rupture, a catastrophic tearing of the uterus, and severe infection. The sheer physical toll could simply overwhelm the mother's body, leading to death from sheer exhaustion and trauma. The lack of effective interventions meant that if the baby would not descend, the mother was often doomed. While not understood as a separate condition, severe cases of preeclampsia or eclampsia, characterized by high blood pressure, swelling, and seizures during pregnancy or labor, undoubtedly led to maternal deaths. Without understanding its cause or having any means of managing it, a woman suffering a severe seizure during labor would have been a terrifying sight and often a prelude to her death. Fear was compounded by the fact that there was no pain relief, no anesthesia. A woman was fully conscious through every agonizing contraction, every desperate push, every moment of fear for herself and her baby. She was acutely aware of every complication, every sign of distress in her own body. Pain itself, unalleviated, contributed to her exhaustion and shock, further increasing her vulnerability. For a woman in 1235, facing childbirth was not just a rite of passage, it was a confrontation with her own mortality. She would make preparations for her death, often saying her goodbyes to her family, making her confession, and settling her affairs. Community would gather, not just in support, but often in a state of solemn anticipation, knowing that the outcome was far from guaranteed. If she already had children, the fear of leaving them motherless, orphaned, or dependent on a new stepmother was a profound and crushing worry. Her husband, her family, and her community understood the grave risk she was taking. The shadow of death was therefore the most pervasive and terrifying fear. It was the knowledge that this fundamental, natural act, the very continuation of life, was for her, the mother, a potent and ever-present threat to her own existence. It was a terrifying lottery of life and death, played out in every home, every season, a constant reminder of the fragility of life, and the immense courage it took for a woman to embrace the profound and ultimate sacrifice that childbirth demanded in the harsh reality of 1235. Number 9. Excruciating pain, a scream silenced by fate. Imagine experiencing pain so intense, so relentless, that it pushed the very limits of human endurance, a pain that could last for days, and for which there was absolutely no relief. This was the terrifying reality of childbirth for women in 1235, a world where the concept of pain management for labor was utterly unknown. Fear of this excruciating, unalleviated pain was not just an abstract concept. It was a visceral, primal terror that permeated every aspect of a woman's anticipation of childbirth, a fear that made the very idea of labor a nightmare of suffering. The medieval understanding of pain was deeply intertwined with religious and moral beliefs. Pain, particularly the pain of childbirth, was often viewed as a divine punishment for Eve's original sin, a decree from God that women would bring forth children in sorrow. This theological interpretation, combined with the lack of medical knowledge, meant that alleviating labor pain was not just difficult, it was often seen as unnatural, undesirable, or even sinful. There were no opiates, no epidurals, no nitrous oxide, no general anesthesia. The strongest pain relief a woman might receive was perhaps a diluted herbal tea with mild sedative properties, or alcohol, which might dull the senses slightly, but would do little to quell the overwhelming physical agony of contractions. A woman in labor would experience the full, unmitigated force of every contraction. The uterine muscles, incredibly powerful, would clench and tighten, pushing the baby down the birth canal, causing immense pressure on the cervix, the pelvis, and the surrounding organs. This was often described as being crushed, torn, or ripped apart from the inside. And it wasn't just a few contractions. Labor could last for hours, 12, 24, or even several days in complicated cases. Imagine enduring that level of pain, relentlessly, hour after hour, without a moment of respite. Physical exhaustion alone, stemming from such prolonged and intense agony, would have been overwhelming, leaving the woman utterly drained and often in a state of shock. The pain was not just internal. As the baby descended, the tissues of the perineum would stretch and often tear, causing excruciating tearing sensation. Passage of the baby's head through the narrow birth canal could cause immense pressure on the nerves and bones of the pelvis. The sounds of labor, the screams, the grunts, the desperate cries were common in medieval homes, a terrifying symphony of suffering that would echo through the village, a stark reminder to every other woman of the ordeal that awaited. Beyond the physical torment, there was a profound psychological dimension to this unalleviated pain. It stripped women of their dignity, their control, and sometimes their very sanity. Imagine being trapped within your own body, helpless against such overwhelming force, your mind screaming for release that never comes. The memory of this unmitigated agony would stay with women long after the birth, scarring them both physically and emotionally. It was a trauma that many would carry for the rest of their lives, a silent testament to the raw, brutal reality of medieval childbirth. The fear of this pain was deeply ingrained from a young age. Girls would hear stories from their mothers and aunts. They would witness the after effects of difficult births, and they would know, with a dread certainty, that this unimaginable suffering was an inescapable part of their future. It was not a pain one could simply prepare for in the modern sense. It was a pain to be endured, to be survived, often with the belief that perseverance through it was a testament to one's faith and strength. The role of the midwife in such circumstances was primarily one of encouragement and emotional support, as she had no pharmacological means to alleviate the pain. She would offer comforting words, perhaps a hand to squeeze or a cool cloth for the brow. But her presence was a stark reminder that this pain was simply something to be endured, a terrifying and inescapable aspect of the birthing process itself. The silence that might follow a birth, whether from exhaustion or tragedy, would have been a chilling contrast to the earlier screams. In 1235, the excruciating pain of childbirth was not just a symptom, it was a defining characteristic of the experience, a fear so profound that it overshadowed almost everything else. It was the raw, unvarnished reality of a body pushed to its absolute limits, screaming for release that would not come until the very end, if it came at all. This unalleviated suffering, combined with the omnipresent risk of death, made childbirth a terrifying ordeal, a scream silenced by fate, leaving a lasting imprint of profound fear on every woman's journey into motherhood. Number 10, the social silence. No one talked about it. Imagine a monumental, terrifying experience that every woman in your community must face, an ordeal fraught with agony and death, yet it is rarely, if ever, openly discussed. In 1235, the immense fears surrounding childbirth were amplified by a pervasive social silence. While everyone knew of the dangers, the intimate details of labor, the agonizing pain, the complications, and the frequent deaths were often not spoken of directly, especially not to young, unmarried women. This lack of open dialogue meant that while the fear was omnipresent, it was also shrouded in mystery, leading to heightened anxiety, a feeling of isolation, and a terrifying sense of unpreparedness for the brutal reality that awaited every woman. Childbirth was considered a deeply private, female-centric event. Men were typically excluded from the birthing room, and the detailed experiences were shared only among women, often only among those who had already endured the ordeal. For young girls, the knowledge of childbirth came through whispers, veiled warnings, the sight of swollen bellies, and the eventual news of a new baby or, tragically, a death. They might hear the screams from a neighbor's house, or witness the solemn procession to a funeral for a woman who died in childbed. These indirect observations, coupled with the absence of direct, honest conversations, fueled a terrifying sense of dread. What exactly happened behind those closed doors? What was this unspeakable pain? How did women die? The unanswered questions left immense room for the imagination to conjure horrors, making the fear more potent than if it were openly addressed. This social silence extended beyond the immediate act of birth to the very concept of complication. If a woman suffered a severe tear, or was left with lasting injuries like a fistula leading to incontinence, she might endure her suffering in secret, her condition often leading to social isolation and shame. There was no public discourse about these female ailments, and certainly no support groups or medical professionals she could openly consult without stigma. Fear of being left with a debilitating condition, a constant reminder of a failed or traumatic birth, and having to bear it silently, was a profound source of terror. Women learned to endure in quiet desperation, contributing to the pervasive silence around the true costs of childbirth. Moreover, the lack of communication meant a severe dearth of shared knowledge and best practices. While midwives passed down their wisdom through apprenticeship, a broader public understanding of what might help or hinder was limited. A woman might enter labor without truly understanding the stages, what her body was meant to do, or what complications to watch for. She relied entirely on the midwife's knowledge, which itself was imperfect and often rooted in tradition rather than scientific understanding. This fundamental lack of information left women feeling vulnerable and utterly unprepared for the intense physical and emotional challenge ahead. It was like going into battle blindfolded, knowing only that the battle was fierce and often fatal. Cultural reverence for fertility and motherhood, while seemingly positive, also contributed to this silence by creating an unspoken pressure to endure. To complain too much or to express overwhelming fear might be seen as a weakness or even a lack of faith. Women were expected to be stoic, to embrace their destiny, and to simply bear what came. This expectation, while a testament to their strength, also forced their fears inward, preventing the formation of a collective voice that might have demanded better understanding or care. Courage of medieval women in childbirth was immense, but it was often a courage born of necessity and isolation. The social silence meant that each woman faced her terrifying ordeal largely alone, even if surrounded by women. The unspoken fears accumulated, passed down generationally through hushed tones and knowing glances rather than open, empowering conversations. This lack of discourse perpetuated ignorance, intensified anxiety, and made the inevitable confrontation with labor an even more terrifying leap into the dark. 1235, the greatest fears of childbirth were not just the physical dangers, but the chilling silence that surrounded them, leaving women to confront their deepest anxieties in profound solitude, a terrifying testament to a world where some of life's most profound experiences were too dangerous or too intimate to be truly spoken. Number 11, the absence of medical science, unseen forces at play. Imagine a world where your most agonizing and life-threatening experience is governed by forces you cannot see, understand, or control, and where the people trying to help you are equally in the dark. 1235, the single most overarching reason for a woman's profound fear of childbirth was the near total absence of genuine medical science as we understand it today. Illness, including complications in childbirth, was largely attributed to mystical causes, imbalances of humors, divine displeasure, or even malevolent spirits. This meant that when things went wrong, there was no scientific framework for diagnosis, no evidence-based treatment, and no real hope of intervention, leaving women utterly at the mercy of fate and a terrifyingly unknown biological process. Dominant medical theory of the time was humorism, inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. This theory posited that the human body was composed of 4 basic humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a state of balance between these humors, and illness was a result of an imbalance. Treatment, therefore, focused on restoring this balance through methods like bloodletting, purging, or specific dietary regimens, none of which had any real efficacy against the physiological complexities of childbirth complications like hemorrhage or infection. Imagine being told that your prolonged labor was due to an excess of black bile, or that your fever was caused by too much blood, and then being subjected to treatments that would only weaken you further. This profound misunderstanding of basic anatomy and physiology meant that the actual mechanisms of labor, the intricate dance of hormones, muscle contractions, and fetal positioning, were completely a mystery. There was no germ theory. The idea that tiny, invisible organisms could cause disease was centuries away. Instead, illness was often attributed to miasma, or bad air, or to planetary alignments or witchcraft. This ignorance of germ transmission meant that basic hygiene was neglected, and infections, as we've discussed, were rampant and lethal. For a woman in labor, this meant that the very air she breathed, the hands that touched her, and the bed she lay on could be laden with invisible killers, and no one knew how to stop them. Fear of these unseen, uncontrollable forces added a layer of dread to the physical dangers, transforming childbirth into a battle against an invisible, unpredictable enemy. Diagnostic capabilities were almost non-existent. There were no stethoscopes to listen to a baby's heartbeat, no instruments to measure blood pressure, no understanding of internal organ function. A midwife would rely on external palpation, her experience, and her intuition. She could tell if a baby was coming, but she could not tell if it was in distress, or if the mother was internally bleeding, or if her uterus was rupturing. Complications could unfold rapidly and fatally, completely unbeknownst to the attendants until the very last, agonizing moments. This meant that intervention, when it was attempted at all, was usually too late, a desperate, often futile, last resort rather than a proactive measure. The medical knowledge that did exist was often mixed with superstition and religious belief. Prayers and charms were considered just as, if not more, potent than herbal remedies. This blending of the spiritual and the practical meant that rational approaches to problems were often overshadowed by appeals to the divine or the mystical. While faith undoubtedly provided comfort, it could not stop a hemorrhage or deliver an obstructed baby. Belief that one's fate was entirely in God's hands, while offering solace, also meant that human intervention was seen as limited, adding to the sense of helplessness in the face of inevitable tragedy. For the woman experiencing childbirth, the absence of medical science translated into a terrifying gamble. She could feel her body struggling, she could feel the pain, but she had no way of knowing what was truly happening inside, or if she was on the brink of disaster. The midwife, her only hope of assistance, was also operating in a realm of profound ignorance. There was no recourse to specialized hospitals, no emergency medical services, no hope of advanced surgical intervention. The natural process faltered. It was often a death sentence for both mother and child, a brutal testament to the limitations of medieval understanding. This overwhelming lack of scientific knowledge transformed childbirth into a journey into the terrifying unknown, a desperate struggle against unseen forces and physiological mysteries. Fear was not just of pain or death, but of an inescapable fate determined by an inscrutable world, leaving women utterly vulnerable to the whims of biology and the cruel hand of chance in a way that modern medicine has largely, though not entirely, mitigated. 1235, every woman knew that when she entered labor, she was stepping into a realm where science offered no answers, and only desperate hope remained. Number 12, obstructed labor, when the body betrayed. Imagine being trapped within your own body, the very life you are trying to bring forth becoming an insurmountable obstacle, transforming what should be a moment of new beginnings into a prolonged, agonizing siege. This was the terrifying reality of obstructed labor, or dystocia, for women in 1235. It was a situation where, for a multitude of reasons, the baby simply could not pass through the birth canal, turning the natural process of childbirth into a protracted nightmare of suffering, exhaustion, and almost certain death for both mother and child. This was perhaps the most prolonged and deeply feared complication, a terrifying betrayal by one's own body. Obstructed labor was a dire scenario, and it could arise from several factors, none of which could be effectively managed in the 13th century. Firstly, the most common cause was cephalopelvic disproportion, meaning the baby's head was too large to fit through the mother's pelvis. Women in 1235, especially those from poorer backgrounds, often suffered from rickets or other nutritional deficiencies during their own childhood. This could lead to a malformed or narrowed pelvis, making the passage of even a normally sized baby extremely difficult, if not impossible. Imagine the terror of pushing with all your might, hour after hour, feeling the immense pressure, the excruciating pain, knowing that the baby is trying to come but simply cannot. Secondly, the positioning of the baby could cause obstruction. While many babies present head first and face down, sometimes a baby would be breech feet or bottom first, or transverse, lying sideways across the womb. In other cases, the head might be deflexed, presenting with the forehead or face first, which makes passage through the pelvis extremely difficult. Without the ability to perform an accurate internal examination to diagnose the presentation, and certainly without the tools or knowledge for safe manual or instrumental rotation, the midwife could only watch, pray, and offer desperate, ultimately futile advice for the woman to push. The feeling of a baby being stuck, refusing to move despite immense effort, would have been a terrifying sign of impending doom. As labor became obstructed, the consequences for both mother and baby were catastrophic. For the mother, the sheer physical exhaustion was immense. Labor could stretch for days, sometimes even a week, without the baby advancing. The uterine muscles, contracting relentlessly, would eventually fatigue and potentially rupture, a fatal event. Constant pressure of the baby's head against the soft tissues of the mother's birth canal, the bladder, and the rectum could lead to severe tearing and necrosis. If the mother survived, this prolonged pressure often resulted in devastating, lifelong injuries such as fistulas, holes that developed between the vagina and the bladder or rectum, leading to uncontrollable leakage of urine or feces. These conditions were not only physically debilitating, but also led to social ostracization due to the pervasive smell and the inability to maintain cleanliness. Imagine surviving the ordeal only to be left with such a horrific, permanent disability. For the baby, the outcome was almost universally fatal in cases of prolonged obstruction. Pressure on the baby's head and umbilical cord could lead to asphyxia, cutting off oxygen supply and causing brain damage or death. The baby would often succumb before delivery, becoming a stillborn. Prolonged labor also increased the risk of infection for the baby as it remained in the birth canal for too long, exposed to bacteria. The midwife's role in an obstructed labor was agonizingly limited. She could encourage the mother to change positions, use some traditional remedies, or attempt gentle manual manipulation. But when faced with a true physical obstruction, her skills and tools were utterly inadequate. She would eventually have to recognize that the baby was not coming, and then make the horrifying decision to either let both mother and baby die, or, in rare, desperate circumstances where the baby was already dead, attempt an embryotomy, the dismemberment of the fetus within the womb to save the mother. This procedure, horrific as it sounds, was a testament to the utter lack of viable alternatives and would have been performed on a fully conscious woman, leaving her with profound physical and psychological trauma. Fear of obstructed labor was deeply ingrained in the psyche of medieval women. It was the ultimate betrayal by one's own body, the ultimate sign that fate had turned against you. It meant not just the agony of pain, but the terror of knowing that you were trapped, that time was running out, and that despite all your strength and efforts, the new life you hoped for might never fully emerge, and your own life might end in a prolonged, futile struggle. Desperate cries from women caught in this nightmare, the somber faces of the attendants, and the eventual, often tragic, silence served as stark warnings to every other woman in 1235 that their body, for all its miraculous power to create life, could also become their most terrifying, inescapable prison.